The world is changing faster than you can imagine. The old systems are collapsing. Join us as we delve into the minds driving the future, the Clean Titans.
Welcome back to Clean Titans. We often discuss clean energy solutions, but the hardest problem, true bottleneck, lies in the heavy industries, steel, cement, and chemicals. Our guest today is an expert who operates at the nexus of technology, finance, and policy to solve this intractable problem. He is Dakshesh Thacker, an electrical engineer by training, policy expert, Columbia SIPA, and currently focused on decarbonizing heavy industry at Ceres, working closely with major investors. DK, welcome to the channel.
Thank you so much for the introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm really glad that you've recognized the importance of industrial decarbonization and some of the work that we do at Ceres and the efforts that we take to work with investors as well as policymakers for some of the work that we've been doing. Thank you so much for inviting me.
You have a fascinating career path from electrical engineer to working with state governments in India on water safety, then pivoting to ESG, investing in heavy industry decarbonization in New York. What was the core realization, the aha moment that made you realize that policy and finance angles was more critical than the pure engineering solutions for climate change?
Thank you so much. Apart from my trajectory, I still feel that engineering is the core way to climate-related issues as well, which is what I try to talk about through the Substack newsletter that I write, deep dive into decarbonization. But concerning my own journey, there's a couple of aha moments. You realize, and you've already noted, I did electrical engineering many years back. Why I did it was because I was good at high school maths and science, and like most students in India, you basically end up studying either for engineering or medicine. So I just mindlessly ended up like electrical engineering because I liked the curriculum that was being offered by the engineering college I got into. And then after that, I did not do engineering. I was a bad engineer. I liked engineering. It did not like me back. And then as a result, I moved into development and worked in that space for a few years. And while I was in my work in SIPA Consulting in India, which is India's leading development sector consulting firm, I did some environmental work on water safety and security and natural resources management. And that's when I realized the growing importance of work related to climate and sustainability, which was then just picking up conversation in India pre-COVID. That was one trigger moment for me. And then when I was applying to policy schools, I was looking for policy schools where I could do a lot more work related to energy and environment. The second major aha moment for me was working at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University, which is a policy think tank started by Jason Bordoff, a very senior energy policy scholar at Columbia University. Work there kind of taught me a lot about the importance of policy and how we can influence decisions through the work that we do in terms of rigorous policy research. And that kind of got me more deeper into understanding nexus of climate and energy beyond just like wider environmental problems. And then over the last couple of years working at Ceres, I've really been able to like some of the work that we do with investors, large public market ones, the power that they bring and the influence that they have on large industrial operators in the world. So just these three major episodes, which have been over a period of time, and a lot of self-reflection has taught me about how engineering, finance, and policy are all equally important to be able to solve the climate problems that we face today.
You've spent time analyzing infrastructure in dense cities like Mumbai and Manhattan. What's the most taken for granted piece of high emissions infrastructure, like the steel in data centers or the cement in bridges, that you believe city dwellers must start paying more attention to?
So from my understanding, data centers, of course, are going to be the large cause for just a lot of energy guzzling in the future. But most of them are not going to be set up in urban locations. Like extremely unlikely that they're going to be close to any major city like Mumbai or Manhattan. Maybe in other countries, they may be close to urban centers. So I don't think data centers are going to like a major role in terms of that's something like an urban city dweller would want to about, at least if they're not working in the climate sector. It's that, which is why I feel that we need a lot more awareness amongst the general public about what's happening very far away. And that's something that we should also speak about, like awareness related to like the emissions caused by heavy industry is poor in the general audience. The problems that are there, I think, especially in Mumbai, we have a lot of infrastructural development these days in reconstruction and redevelopment of commercial as well as residential real estate. Course, that causes a lot of pollution, a lot of congestion in the city. Have high levels of NOx leading to high AQI, which is an environmental problem. But it's also an opportunity for like low carbon steel and cement, and how we can see whether like in the construction industry can procure such material and reduce their emissions at least, built environment.
Green steel is critical as it underpins construction, transport, and manufacturing. Skeptics still ask, can it be actualized and who will buy it? What is your opinion?
So green steel, low carbon steel is a possibility in many parts of the world already. For example, United States is probably one of the cleanest steel industries in the world. So the president of the United States, Mr. Trump, is already fairly correct in that sense that they're fairly ahead on its high-tech work that they do. The United States industry, which is largely secondary-based steelmaking, has been cleaner and less emissive for the longest period of time. Similarly, we see opportunities in Europe as well. Like in Northern Europe, we brought some of the first two low-carbon or like zero-carbon steel by Stegra and SIPA, which will be directly reduced iron with green hydrogen run by renewable energy. And there's prospects for it in other parts of the world as well. Southern Europe, Brazil, which has a relatively cleaner grid with a high ore for the directly reduced iron. So wherever we can like get green iron, solve a large part of the emissions coming in the steel process, we can create low carbon iron and then eventually low carbon steel itself. There are pathways which exist. The economic feasibility, which is the largest question in the two markets where steel production is going to be the largest in the next few years, which is India and China. Currently, I'm trying to explore and see what the possibility of it is in India in the next few years. And that's a question that requires further exploration. DRI-EAF may not be possible, but we see slow change there as well. Recently, in one of India's leading steelmaking companies, JSW Steel, announced that they're going to do DRI green hydrogen in one of their major locations. And so with some of the market leaders taking that up, it could have an impact on some of the others to also follow suit with other incentives pushing them towards as well.
The JSW proof point. You've talked about JSW Steel's move towards green hydrogen-based DRI-EAF steelmaking in India. Why is this specific technology shift, direct reduced iron electric arc furnace, the most viable path for emerging markets like India and China, rather than, say, carbon capture and on existing blast furnaces?
Got it. No, you're absolutely right. Like right now, I'm fully sure about China, but in India's case, like most organically, the carbon capture and conversion process, which is not fully effective in the case of steelmaking, could be a viable option as well. There's also a lot of question mark in terms of like whether DRI-EAF with any sort of reductant is viable in India itself right now. Maybe with gas. With the quality of iron ore that we have in India itself, is DRI really going to like be the future is itself a question, which is why what JSW Steel announced with DRI green hydrogen in the future is a remarkable achievement, like very ambitious from India, right? Where we don't yet have the cleanest of grids. We don't yet have like a great amount of like green hydrogen supply, which is why whatever JSW's, if they can pull it off, will be pioneering and a landmark, not from an India perspective, but from a global South perspective as well. Because most of these projects so far are Swedish-based and a few others have potential in the United States. Already have like a relatively cleaner grid and actually like cheap natural gas to start like in the next few years itself.
Let's take a look at the demand signal. You highlighted Microsoft's procurement deal for green steel for its data centers. How critical is this type of large-scale corporate demand signal to making green steel economically viable and moving it from niche to mainstream?
So if you look at like a lot of these carbon steelmaking projects, they require a lot of capital for like lock-in, both in the capex as well as they want to like plan their operating expenditure, make their decisions in terms of like what are they really transition to make low carbons. Which is why when you have like very futuristically sound projects, data centers, which are going to procure large amounts of steel and even for that matter, other material like cement, maybe even timber, glass, whatever have you. It offers like a market signal to the steelmakers to give them an incentive towards, planning their transition itself. I was trying to explain this to somebody else in India. Like, imagine a services company who's trying to create like an order book, and they have like future like services planned 2 years down the line. They know how many people to hire because that's essentially what they need to invest in, like to hire good people, and that's why they need that signal from their clients that they're going to get long-term projects to be able to hire great people. And it's similar in the steel industry. Guys have like 2 to 3 year offtake agreements, or whether it's construction companies or like even government-led infrastructure. In this case, data center. There may be an existing technology. It may have worked in the lab. It may be at a high TRL. It's all about the economics working out them to feasibly see whether it's going to lead to business to make that transition.
The environmental attributes certificate you mentioned are gaining traction for our investor audience. How do EACs, like guarantees of origin instruments, provide the necessary financial mechanism to bridge the cost gap between conventional steel and green steel?
To be very fair, I've a large part in conversation. Organizations and think tanks like RMI have done a lot of good work behind this. Again, to signal good to create like a between steel and steel suppliers. There've also been a couple of skeptics who've spoken about it to me and my team at Ceres. Through our work, we don't particularly push for EACs, but we see it as an important tool as long as it's effective for like steel buyers to send a steel suppliers. I'm all for it. I don't have opinions about it as of yet.
Turning to the financial lens, steelmaking is capital intensive. What role does stewardship investor pressure play when facing heavy industry operators who prioritize short-term returns over expensive long-term capex for green transition?
So this is exactly the work that Ceres does and has been successful for the last few decades, engaging a lot of companies, not just heavy industry operators, but across the real economy itself, including banks, by leveraging the investors that work with, which are mainly public market investors like pension funds, faith-based institutions, and endowments and the kind. We've really been able to push some companies to take certain decisions, notably to get published science-based targets validated by SBTi or other organizations such as in the steel sector, Global Steel Climate Council. And we've also then pushed for what at Ceres, which we call as the Climate Transition Action Plans or CTAPs, which is basically when we're asking, talk about if you've target and you've already disclosed emissions, how are you going to be able to achieve those targets, right? Now, CTAPs serve two purposes. One, it's like a decarbonization roadmap or like a roadmap in terms of what companies want to achieve those targets that they've set and validated by other organizations. Second, it also helps investors mitigate the risk in their portfolio companies, where they get the information to understand, okay, if a company is so-and-so, this is going to mitigate their physical risk, it's going to mitigate their transition risk. And it also helps in facilitating a dialogue between the company and the investor to know what the possible risks are, right? So once there's a disclosure, the investor will have more questions, or they'll probably be more at peace with what the company is doing towards their targets as well. The series serves that role in terms of facilitating that dialogue and in terms of understanding what are some of the opportunities for engagement itself that investors can do.
There have been a lot of hydrogen projects around the world, but they've all fizzled away and ended in disaster or been being shut down. What is hydrogen's realistic role? Where do you see green hydrogen fitting into the actual decarbonization roadmap for heavy industry? Is it a game changer for process heat and feedstock, ammonia fertilizer, or is it being hyped by governments eager to prop up existing gas infrastructure?
No, so green hydrogen and maybe there are forms of hydrogen as well, which are produced by renew clean energy. I think hydrogen to nuclear in the future, there's turquoise as well that I've heard of, have potential as well. I don't see panacea for climate change, but it has multiple applications, as you mentioned, in ammonia and clean fertilizers as well. Large in agricultural countries like India and some of the global south as well, where fertilizer consumption is pretty high. As an alternative as well in different processes, It's got a lot of application on oil and gas as well, from what I understand. But coming to like steel, green hydrogen is the principal reductant which can create or like lead to low carbon, where you have iron ore, hematite, and magnetite, which is then reduced. Traditionally, it's been done by coke. It's also been done by natural gas. But if we get green hydrogen, we can fairly almost entirely reduce emissions. The iron making process itself, which is the most emissive part of steel making. So green hydrogen for the DRI-EAF pathway is the most critical. There are a couple of other more futuristic transition technologies which are not yet at commercial scale or industrial scale. They might not require green hydrogen. They require electrolysis of kind, but it's far away to say how successful they're going to be in terms of like producing the amount of that we require for the development in the world. But for current demand projection, if we have to go down the DRI-EAF path, it's got to be green hydrogen in all countries in the future.
I interviewed Dr. from physicist from MIT. He wrote a book called The Hydrogen Hype. He says when you look at logistics problem and look at 40% of the energy just lost to keeping hydrogen, storing it, and putting it under pressure and transporting it. So if you lose half the amount of energy in a fuel, then the physics and the economics are not with you. And when physics and economics are not with you, then government subsidies can so far. It doesn't work in the real world.
No, absolutely, you're right. Like first, like the science, and then after that, the engineering in terms of like being able to like science, and after that, the economic feasibility comes into question, right? Which is why I don't think green hydrogen is happening right now at large scale, except for a couple of projects, which are closely located. Ones at Stegra and SSAB in Sweden. In the United States, all the DRI plants almost entirely run on natural gas itself. They have like plans transitioning by blue green hydrogen in the future. So absolutely right. Until like and then transportation is, and also like the cost for renewable energy reduces a little bit further, especially in countries like India. Until then, it's going to be a bit of a challenge.
The cost of coming down so rapidly, and now batteries, that you don't even need anything else anymore, right? Okay, let's turn to material science. Talk about the $1 trillion material science industry that's coming. And I've seen some AI talking about that. Up until now, products assembling parts, and at some point, we'll assembling products at the molecular level, like a seed assembled gives us fruit at the molecular level. So you've highlighted research on silver, niobate, and length for supercapacitors. What is the biggest material science gap right now that, if solved, would fundamentally accelerate the clean energy transition? For example, cheaper long duration storage or better heat resistance? Go ahead.
If you look at it fundamentally, right, like, I mean, at the heart of transition is clean energy. Now, if you want to like green the grid in all parts of the world, we want to phase out fossil fuels and entirely rely on renewable energy. We need to solve for batteries, for the storage part of things, right? Like, so whatever materials can help reduce costs and also improve their efficiency is where I would put significant amount of money in material science research. Not only to clean the grid, and then of course, once the grid's greener, that can then be supplied to other industries as well, and eventually for other sectors.
The R&D investment gap. Your work touches on policy and international development. What single policy reform is most needed to ensure that fundamental scientific and engineering research, like the supercapacitors work in India, moves out of the lab and into commercial deployment?
Yeah, no, so this is actually a very fortuitous question that you asked me today. I was just discussing this night over dinner with a leading thinker in India who works in deep tech and science and engineering policy. So it's well known that to get first some amount of innovation done, you need like great academic environment, you need to facilitate fundamental science and engineering, which say the United States does to the National Science Foundation and its grants to like higher education institutions like the top universities. India has now recently instituted a similar foundation called the ARF in India, which is given a large amount of money to like fund such research. Now, once to a certain TRL level, And they need to like first be able to build partnerships with corporates, right? So like the government needs to play some sort of like a facilitation role here in terms of like identifying technologies and where it can have offtake or interest in the corporate world itself, right? For example, if you look at Stegra, it had a lot of investors who are also off-takers. So they got their investment from some of the auto companies and people who would eventually be interested in buying low carbon steel. If you also look at some of the other innovative startups in the steel space, that's Electra and Boston Metal, they're funded legacy steel makers like Nucor and ArcelorMittal, who eventually they could probably like, license their technology to, or like partner with to be large scale. So like hypothetically assume a supercapacitor exists, there's a government that's facilitated its development, they've reached a certain TRL level, then the idea is then to be able to make them meet the right audience, and the government could play a role there. Then after that, once they reach probably like the potential for commercial scale, and I think this is an innovation that's happened in China, where they've allowed deep tech pre-revenue startups, I'm trying to like read this, to be able to access money from public markets. Now, I don't know how successful that's going to be, but essentially what that does is that it solves like the money access gap for a lot of these startups which have large gestation periods, require a large amount of capital for being able to like, take their innovative products, or at least just like, refine the one product that they'll be able to hit the market. Which sometimes in the VC and private equity market, where there's that chase for that exit, sometimes some of these companies may just, lose putting so much of pressure on them to be able to get the returns that they're seeking. So this may be an innovative suggestion, which I think I'm not fully like aware of what China is doing here, but could be one way of like solving the problem of access for myself for them.
You have consulted on international development. How can philanthropic foundations and international organizations best direct their capital to support decentralized, ground-up material science innovations in emerging markets, such as centralized in emerging markets versus centralized top-down research programs?
No, so this is something that I think about a lot, right? Like, so climate philanthropies or like philanthropies in general, they're like organizations or like NGOs, they'll fund tanks, they'll give money to like, augment the capacity of governments. In cases, they'll probably fund private sector organizations as well for like more research and knowledge building and building work itself. But if you think about the climate change challenge, we're not going to be able to solve it without, effectively supporting climate solutions to like, solve problems with governments which cause these. As a result, I feel that climate philanthropy should start pivoting some of its allocation towards early stage solutions itself, like funding green hydrogen solutions, funding recycling, carbon capture and conversion at a very early stage. Not a very large check, but essentially when you're like helping them at their very early, when they're struggling, before like an angel or VC comes in and, as I said, mentioned again, starts putting pressure on them, there is a scope in a climate philanthropy to start exploring opportunities there. And I mean, if climate philanthropy is feasible, start taking certain positions in some of these companies, it could like lead them to like increasing the size of their endowment in the long run. So to be able to solve or like reach the goals that they have in mind, of course, they should be supporting the organization that they traditionally do. Startups as well as academic research will be important here as well, especially in certain countries where government funding for climate-related work is reducing these days. Philanthropy a major role there. I think philanthropy, if you look at them, most of them are organizations which have tremendous social capital, being able to influence the private sector as well as government. When you somehow create a nexus between startup and innovation and philanthropy, that connection to be able to like meet the government or to meet corporates for further funding and to like scale their technology becomes a lot, which is why I think philanthropy has a role there, which is slightly underexplored, but I see certain organizations are trying to change that. The Global Industry Hub, which was started by Climate Works Foundation, now is supporting a lot more innovation, and I see a lot more other philanthropies probably going to be interested in this area and maybe deep tech as well.
When advising investors, what is the core difference between ESG screening, simply avoiding oil stocks, and active stewardship, engaging shareholders and boards? Why is active stewardship the more powerful tool for decarbonizing heavy industries?
So the way I've reflected on this is like, when you sanction a company, you're not losing any scope for like engagement and like trying to get them to shift. All of these decisions, and we have to respect the fact that when companies operate, however emissive and polluting they are, they also have jobs associated with it, which is a really important aspect. When I was growing up in college in India, a lot of people wanted to work in Core India Limited just simply because of the power that it had, the heft that it had for certain parts of India that operated in. Of course, it offered attractive packages. So growing up, I realized that some of the most important things with any company operating is the jobs and the contribution it has toward the economic development itself in the country in which it operates. Now, when you sanction a company, you basically lose the opportunity to engage with them to be a part of this long-term decision making. And for any company, especially the fossil fuel companies, which are energizing the economy, they're giving jobs. This transition is going to be a long-drawn process. Now, when you are not actively stewarding them and you're just sanctioning them, you're losing the opportunity to be able to be a part of the change. And there'll probably be investors left who don't want to steward them or just engage them towards this and aggressively. So I believe that you need to invest it, maybe reduce your positions over a period of time gradually, and announce that with intent, we're planning to phase out coal or any other fossil fuels over a period of time. Announce that so that it's a strong signal to the companies itself to know that they're not going to be able to access finance, but give them the time to be able to make that transition itself.
For the built environment, you noted that data center construction drives infrastructure growth. Since big tech companies like Microsoft are large purchasers of steel and concrete, are they currently doing enough to drive down Scope 3 emissions in their built environments? Or are they still primarily focused on their Scope 2 power consumption?
Actually, no. I think there's a growing reducing emissions as well. And I think Ceres has done some incredible work to work with some of the big tech companies that we do to engage them on Scope 3 reduction, the tougher piece. So the 5 or 6 large tech giants in the world have immense, a large number of suppliers. And as a result, just because of the size of the business, they probably give these suppliers, both large ones as well as SMEs, they have the opportunity to be able to decarbonize a very large part of supply chains in steel, cement, in materials as well, glass, rubber, maybe aluminum as well, depending on the requirement, transportation, because some of them have large vehicle fleets. There is movement towards trying to decarbonize their Scope 3 emissions. Is a very relative question. Are they going to be able to reduce Scope 3 emissions? No. They're definitely they're far ahead of the curve compared to a lot of other companies in terms of are they reporting on a lot more categories on the GHG protocol? Yes. Are they engaging suppliers? Yes, that's a growing interest. And they're also trying to give signals to their suppliers in terms of their interest and intent to procure low carbon material, as well as take other action as well. I've not fully been all the disclosures, but I understand they've also been disclosing a lot more in terms of their plans for Scope 3 emissions reduction as well.
You mentioned climate remaining on the backseat of mass market podcasts and need for a food farmer or climate. What message or narrative is the climate community failing to convey to the mainstream audience that prevents the shift from conferences to dinner tables?
Got it. Thank you so much for asking this question. So for first context for an American audience, Food, I would highly recommend that you look him up, is a former McKinsey consultant who studied at Wharton, who's of Indian origin. He went back to India, and he focuses on talking about it and especially trying to debunk a lot of what food companies, especially food processing companies, put out in terms of consumer products in India, and speaking about how much it impacts the health of Indians, because we have epidemic crises in terms of heart-related ailment and diabetes and other such chronic ailments which have come from consuming a lot of not well-produced food, even though we have a lot of natural produce in agriculture in India as well. And this is especially prevalent in the urban, affluent middle class and upper class communities, which has been historically consuming such products. So the work he does essentially is trying to put out simple content and educating the audience about some of these problems through YouTube, Instagram, and other media platforms. Now, this has changed the conversation and in terms of how food-related companies and processing companies are products, in terms of how they're being honest with what they're really using, and also responding to the audience, because he's creating that narrative in terms of hey, you need to hold them up to what they're really putting out there. Now, think about it in terms of the climate change space as well, right? When an average Joe sits and eats his dinner, they're eating their shrimp scampi, they're eating pasta. Are they really thinking in terms of the plate in which they're eating, the steel plate, where was the steel produced? What kind of emissions went behind it? What was the health impact on the people producing the steel? The generations of people who worked in steel and coal plants, there have been cancer and other ailments as well. But the average Joe doesn't really end up thinking about that because it's just not so much in conversation. Whereas if you think about, like, say, defense and semiconductors, or like all of that work is so much about that an average Joe might at least talk about it sometimes in some of their conversations as well. Which is why I believe that there is a need for, influencers and on the right, somebody like an influencer to be able to demystify some of these industrial decarbonization or what some of the larger problems are for the common audience. Because then they can go to their legislator, they can go to the congressman, and they can talk to them about, hey, what are you going to do about this? Most of the average Joe understands energy affordability because that's about your payment for your utility bills at the end of the day, right? And that's a lot more in debate, and it also shapes politics, especially in parts of the United States and I think other parts of the global north as well. Not so much in India, but that's also changing with times. So essentially what we need to do is to be able to integrate this in conversation, talk about issues related to emissions, related to pollution, speak about how it impacts communities, how those communities' jobs perpetuate because people basically let go of their health because they want to work in a specific steel mill or a coal plant or in an aluminum smelter because some of those guys don't know anything else to do. There's really old...
Very sad.
Yes. There's a really old Bollywood movie from 70s or 80s called as Kala Patthar, which literally translates into Black Rock or Black Stone, which is about the plight of coal mine workers and how they have to deal with a crooked coal mine owner who makes work in unsafe conditions. So that kind of brought about some amount of narrative back then. But what I want to say is that basically there needs to be a lot more universalization of conversations related to industrial pollution and industrial emissions in data.
Now turning to the disclosure. You're familiar with reporting standards SBTi, TCFD, FRS, S1, S2. Are current disclosure frameworks sufficient to hold companies accountable for their long-term decarbonization plans? Or are we still lacking a clear, globally harmonized metric for transition planning?
So in terms of sufficiency, short answer would be no, because this at the end of the day is just reporting and compliance and just signaling to involved with a certain company in terms of what a company is doing or not doing. So unless there is action and unless people start reducing emissions and progress and what challenges they're facing and what they're going to do to solve those challenges, all of this is just great to have information today. But is it going to really solve the problem? No. In terms of harmonization, right? So I think the industry is a little bit transition. Sustainability, as we know it, of course, has its origins 70, 80 years back in the environmental movement. But corporate sustainability is still relatively new, a couple of decades. The way I thought about this is think about 100 years back. Of course, we didn't have the technology, but the accounting industry probably also had a lot of transition as well, where had to start harmonizing the way that their finances and get audited and start reporting to the securities agencies in which they operate, the security boards which regulate them for trading their shares. At some point, to be able to reach some sort of harmonization, maybe 10, 20 years down the line, as we get further clarity in terms of what is the definite information set that we need and what do we not need. Right now, I think a lot of disclosures ask for a lot of information which overlaps, which is why I can imagine from a company's perspective why they feel the fatigue, right? They need to report on. I think about it from an Indian company's perspective, which has to meet domestic regulatory requirements, and operating in Europe, they have to meet CSRD and other reporting requirements in Europe as well. If they're operating in California, which also has its own sub-national regulatory requirements and reporting, they probably have to spend money towards that. So the cost of this compliance is going to be slightly high until there's a universal harmony that's achieved, which we do at least at a sectoral level soon enough, so that companies can then reach a common consensus how to report. But if you think about it, this is basically going to be the driver which will tell you about which companies are going to persist and work in the long run. Not being sustainable, companies go out of business. Sectors like food and consumer packaged goods, where the directly gets a say in terms of am I really going to buy this company's product. It doesn't work for them. They go out of business in the long run.
And before we turn to our concluding questions, I wanted to ask you, what was the name of the organization that India set up that's like our US National Science?
I call the Anusudhan Research Foundation. I may be getting the name a little wrong, and it's ARF, Anusudhan Research Foundation. And I believe the people at the Home Affairs are like very well versed with science and technology, has worked with Microsoft India for many years, is in the main grant making.
Excellent. Thank you. DK, unique blend of engineering and policy experiences provide a crucial pathway through the toughest climate problems. Thank you for walking us through the decarbonization blueprint.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. I think although my experiences academically, of course, have given me the training, it's the work experience at like an organization like Ceres, which has been around for 35 years, and at places like Southpaw Consulting and the Center on Global Energy Policy. And I'm really grateful to the people that I've worked through whom I've learned and been able to build my experiences to be able to speak effectively on a topic like this today.
That's Dakshesh Thacker, goes by DK, Manager of Clean Steel and Heavy Industry Decarbonization at Ceres. If this deep dive changed your perspective on the most difficult part of the energy transition, please hit that like button and subscribe to Clean Titans. We'll see you next time with another fascinating and life-changing interview. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
The insights and solutions we discuss here are crucial for a cleaner future. They're about a fundamental shift in mindset. We believe that interviews like this are so profound, they can change the course of your life. If this conversation moved you, hit that subscribe button to join the community that's building the sustainable future. Thank you for watching. Like and tell your friends about Clean Titans and consider supporting us on Buy Me a Coffee. And we'll see you next time on Clean Titans.